Our lesson this evening, we're getting into a study of the books of Judges, and that's where we will begin at more or less to introduce the book itself, because we will be looking at several characters in that book, and so it will only do us well to see the things pertaining to the book of Judges, because it truly is an interesting book, interesting from the standpoint of the part of the history of the children of Israel that it records. So tonight we're looking at an introduction, and we'll look at the first judge of the book, and that is Othniel. You know, when you think of the judges, we normally conjure up a picture in our mind of a individual in a black robe sitting in the setting of a courtroom with the defendant and with the accused and the lawyers and maybe the jury, if it's a trial of jury. That's normally what we perceive when we think and hear the word judge. But that's not at all the sense in which that we're going to be studying concerning the number of judges that the Bible records during this period of Israel's history. In fact, the word judge, as we need to consider it, is a person who decides. He is one who vindicates. He is one who delivers, or he's one that leads or governs. And we'll find that to be true, not necessarily of all of the judges, but at least that definition sort of covers all of the judges that we'll be studying. And these leaders were not governors of all of Israel. And what I mean by that is they were many local individuals, these judges were, who led certain tribes of Israel to freedom over the oppressors. So this is not necessarily always something involving the complete entire nation, all 12 of the tribes, but certainly some instances, isolated cases of what was going on among the nation as a whole. And the interesting thing about the book of Judges is that there is a repeated pattern in that book. One of those repeated statements is the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. And concerning that statement, we first find it in Judges 2 and verse 11. And then we see it again repeated in chapter 3 and verse 7. But then after that, this phrase changes slightly. It changes to, and the children of Israel did evil again in the sight of the Lord. That little word at this again is then from chapter 3. We read it in verse 12, chapter 4, verse 1, chapter 6, verse 1, chapter 10, and verse 6, and also in chapter 13 and verse 1. So that truly is a phrase that we find repeated. The children of Israel did evil, or the children of Israel did evil again in the sight of the Lord. And more times than not, the evil that's being referred to in those statements is the worshiping of the idols that the Canaanites worship. They, of course, from the book of Joshua, we read and studied concerning Joshua, how that he was the one that led Israel across Jordan into the conquering of the land of Canaan. And the Canaanites were made up of different nations. And we find that in all of this, God was executing judgment. But sad to say, they did not all time utterly destroy those nations. And it was the remnant of people that were left from these nations that lived and that the Israelites settled among. And they were idolaters. And so when the children of Israel did evil, the evil that they were doing were the worshiping of these idols of the Canaanites. Primarily, there are two that stand out. One, of course, is Baal. And the plural of that word Baal is Balaam. Now, this is why I mentioned last week in our study of the soothsayer Balaam, that when I was a young boy, I got Baal and Balaam mixed up. I thought they were the same thing. But Balaam, Baalim, is the plural form of the word Baal, which is an idol. And of course, what we studied last week was a man who, of course, Balak tried to get to curse Israel. The other idol that was the outstanding problems to the children of Israel was Ashtaroth. These were the two principal. But really, Baal, that word means master. The word Baal means Lord. And so, as we see now, and as we'll continue to see all through the history of the children of Israel, Baal was that principal, that primary God that, I guess for the lack of a better word, always seemed to be a thorn in the flesh for Israel. She always seemed to, throughout her history, to succumb to the worshiping of Baal, but not exclusively, but he is the prominent one that we find made mention of. And Ashtaroth was one of Baal's companions. She was the female counterpart, the female goddess. And she was considered to be the goddess of love, the goddess of fertility. And so what this adds up to is that between these two idols, between these two gods, were supposedly the means of the control of the weather. Between these two gods, there was in their hands the control of the crops, which of course was a very fundamental way of life in that day and time, and also of offspring. So when you consider those three things, weather, crops, and offspring, you can see what these gods meant to the Canaanites. And of course, with the influence that they had over the Israelites, they, of course, were able to persuade them. The interesting thing, too, and I don't have this on the paper, is that Baal is mentioned 70 times in the scriptures. And out of those 70 times in the scriptures, he's mentioned in 9 of the books of the Old Testament. So a very prominent, a very visible presence among the children of Israel. And that's what we're seeing here in the book of Judges when it says, and they did evil again in the sight of the Lord. So that's one statement that we see repeated. The other statement we see repeated is that God, this is the he of this verse, God sold them, that is Israel, into the hands of their enemies round about. And this we see in Judges 2, verse 14, chapter 3, verse 8, chapter 4, verse 2, and chapter 10, verse 7. So here's a second repeatedly stated that we find in the book of Judges. And the interesting thing, too, that we need to not forget is that this is the statement that's often found after that mention is made of the burning anger of God concerning the evil that was being done by the Israelites. Depending on what translation you use, if most of you use the King James, it says that the evil made God made hot the anger of the Lord. Or in another verse, it says that the anger of the Lord was hot. So call it hot, call it burning. That's usually the statement that is in connection with this statement when it says that God sold them into the hands of their enemies round about. Because at this point, God's anger is boiling because of the evil that Israel is doing. A third statement that we see repeated is, and when the children of Israel cried unto the Lord. This is found in chapter 3, verse 9, and also verse 15, chapter 4, verse 2, chapter 6, verse 6 and 7, and also in chapter 10 and verse 10. Then the children of Israel cried unto the Lord, when God delivered them into the hands of their enemies. Then, whatever the period of time might be, we find eventually the children of Israel crying unto the Lord. And then the fourth statement that we see repeated is, nevertheless, the Lord raised up judges, which delivered them out of the hand of those that spoiled them. So God would raise up a judge. This judge would be what we called a moment ago a deliverer. And this word spoiled here is not a word that is usually used the way that we use the word today. When it says here that God delivered them out of the hands of those that spoiled them, he wasn't talking about that they were pampered. That's normally what we think about when we think about spoiling our children or spoiling our grandchildren. We pamper them, but that's not the word spoil here. That means to ruin, to bring to devastation. And a lot of this oftentimes amounted to slavery, would be the way that they would spoil the children of Israel. That would mean that they would take all of their possessions. I mean, a slave doesn't own anything. What he has will belong to the one who is his captor. So that's the spoil that is being referred to, that God would raise up these judges and would deliver them out of the hands of those that spoiled, those that oppressed them. And that we see in Judges 2, verse 16 and 18, Judges 3, verse 9 and 15, Judges 2, verse 16, chapter 3, verse 9, 15, and 31. In chapter 6, verse 15, 36, and 37. In chapter 7, verse 7. And in chapter 10, verse 12. So these are the four statements that continually are stated over and over throughout the book of Judges. And I thought maybe to put these statements into somewhat of a picture form, this would help to settle in our minds as to what we are talking about, what's going on during this particular period of Israel's history. I call it the judges cycle. They have their disobedience. They do evil in the sight of the Lord. The Lord allows a nation to oppress them. The Israel, after a period of time, repents. Then God raises a judge, and the judge ends the oppression. So that's this unbroken cycle that we see in the book of Judges. Another thing, by way of introduction, these judges were local rulers from different tribes of the children of Israel, who God raised up. And he would raise them up at a specific time against a specific enemy. That's what these judges are. And when you look at all of these judges, as we'll be able to when our study ends of the book, what we'll see is that some of those judges, they took on the role of being a military leader. They had an army behind them. And some of those judges are like Othniel, that we'll be studying in just a moment, Ehud, Barak, Gideon, and Jephthah. These judges, they commanded armies in bringing Israel out from under the oppression of the enemy. Then we see that some of the judges God used to deliver Israel was simply in the role of just a single warrior. No army, just a single individual. And that, of course, is Shamgar, which is probably not as familiar with us, but we're certainly familiar with Samson. I mean, he didn't have an army. He just went about and defeated the Philistines, just single-handedly, of course, with God's help. And then, too, the judges at times were like prophets. Deborah would fall into that category. And, of course, getting back to Samson, we know that Samson was the judge that took the Nazirite vow, which of course led to him having what we always think about Samson is the long hair that Delilah kept bugging him about until he finally gave up his secret and lost his strength. And concerning several of the other judges, we're really not told the particulars, the specifics of their role. Like Tola, Jair, and I'm not pronouncing these correctly, Ibzan, Elon, and Abdon. They're just really very, very little that we know about those judges. And in the book that follows, the book of Judges, which of course is 1 Samuel, what we see is two more judges of Israel. And these judges were priests. There was Eli, and then there was Samuel. So not all of the judges are mentioned in the book of Judges. But that period of God ruling through the judges continues into 1 Samuel. In fact, it was during the time of Samuel that Israel ended the days of the judges. And with the appointment that God commissioned Samuel to make, Israel fell under a monarchy. They now have a king. And of course, we know that that king was Saul. So the time and the period of the judges really continues into the book of Samuel, at least through Eli and through Samuel the priest. Other than that, I didn't put on the paper or on the chart. There are 16 total judges. So that gives us an indication of how many judges there were during this time. So let's look at Othniel. We read about him in Judges chapter 3, verses 7 through 11. And here's what we read. The children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God, and they served the Baals and Ashtaroth. Therefore the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and he sold them into the hands of Cushan Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia. And the children of Israel served Cushan Rishathaim 8 years. When the children of Israel cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer for the children of Israel, who delivered them. Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged Israel. He went out to war, and the Lord delivered Cushan Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, into his hands, and his hands prevailed over Cushan Rishathaim. And there's supposed to be a verse 11 that comes up there. It doesn't. So the land had rest for 40 years. Then Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died. Really, we know very little about Othniel. We know that he was from the tribe of Judah. We know that the Lord called him to be a deliverer, to be a judge. And we know that he was the grandson of Caleb's brother. So we're familiar with Caleb, just as we are familiar with Joshua, who were the only two that lived of that original generation that came out of the land of Egypt and entered into the land of Canaan. But other than that, that's really all we know about Othniel. We see that he lived at a time when Israel was worshiping the gods of the Canaanites. We saw that in verse 7 that we read, when the anger of the Lord was hot, and he sold them into the hands of Cushan, because, of course, of the fact that they were serving these gods. So we see, God caused the king of Mesopotamia. And this king, Cushan, and I know I'm not pronouncing the last part of his name correctly, but in some translations, they take that name and they say Cushan doubly wicked. And I find that interesting. And sometimes that's the case. Sometimes God takes some of the most wicked people to bring judgment against his people. He did it with Babylon in the days of Judah. He did it with the Assyrians in the days of Israel. And so it is that here we see a king with this unusual name, but yet God causes this king of Mesopotamia to oppress Israel. And he does it for 8 years, as we read there in verse 8. And he enslaves Israel until the time is that they cry out to the Lord. And with that, God places his spirit upon Othniel, as we read there in verses 9 and 10. And Othniel goes to war, and he fights against the king of Mesopotamia. And he's victorious. He delivers Israel out of the hands of the king. And the statement is made there in verse 11 that Israel has peace for the duration of Othniel's life, which was for 40 years. Now, what are some lessons that we can see in the story of this first judge that God appoints over Israel. I believe one lesson that we can learn is that it's God that we must serve. You know, the Israelites turned their backs. In fact, that's a statement that's made there in that verse 7. The anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and he sold them into the hand of the king, and the children of Israel served this king 8 years. So we see then that really they turned their backs on God. And their sin led to their enslavement. Just like sin can and will enslave us. Brother Reeves, read us Romans 6 and verse 16.
6 and 16?
Yes. Yeah, it's up here.
Their sins lead to their enslavement, as sin can and will do to us. Romans 6:16. Do you not know that to whom you present yourselves slaves to obey, you are that one slave whom you obey, whether of sin leading to death or of obedience leading to righteousness?
See, do you not know that to whom you present yourselves slaves to obey, you are that one's slave whom you obey? A very simple principle. And it's not without exception. Whoever we yield ourselves to obey, we become a slave to that person, that thing that we obey. And it can be one of two things. It can be sin, and we're given the ultimate consequence of sin. Sin leads to death. The other possibility of who we are a slave to is a slave of obedience. And obviously, this is understood to be obedience unto God, something that's not involved in sin, because that kind of obedience leads to righteousness. So we live in a period of time, we live in a country that is far removed, for the most part, from the concept, the principles of slavery. But not really. Spiritually, no, we're not removed at all. Spiritually, we are slaves. Each and every human being is a slave. We're either a slave to sin, or we're a slave in our obedience unto God. We have two masters, Satan and God. And that's the only two that there is. We're either one or the other. We're either obeying Satan or we're either obeying God. We're either sinning or we're in obedience unto God. And that's the way with the children of Israel. They became slaves to the Mesopotamians because of their sin against God and no longer serving God, turning their back on God. And so that's a lesson that we need to learn, that we must serve God. And that's forever true for all times. This is a principle that never goes out of style, never goes out of effect. We must serve God, or else we are a slave.
Othniel must have been slave unto God until death.
Yeah, very true. Now, a second lesson I think we can see is that if we repent, God will deliver us from sin. Is that not what we see in this incident of Othniel? And keep this in mind, this is what we will see in the case of each and every one of these judges. Israel sins, They eventually repent, and God delivers them. So if we repent, God will deliver us from sin. You know, it's interesting though that it took Israel 8 years to realize they needed God. But you know, that's really the way a lot of folks today are. A lot of folks, they don't think that they need God. And you know, when you think about it, Israel might just very well have thought that they could just simply shake off this oppression. Yeah, well, but, eventually things will get better. And that's the way some people think in their lives. Well, I know I'm not living right, but sooner or later I'm gonna make it right. Or the children of Israel could have well made light of those sufferings at the very beginning. This is as bad as it'll get. And that's the way of people in sin. They say, well, this is all we're going to do. But no, what's the old saying? Sin takes us farther than we want to go, and it keeps us longer than we want to stay. And Israel could have said, they could have let their pride kept them from really seeing their situation. The reality of their situation was they were hopeless without God. But when they were doing their evil, did you think they thought they were hopeless? No. Do you think people today, when they're doing things contrary to God's will, do you think that they are hopeless? No, they don't think it. So see, every one of these 3 points that we're seeing concerning Israel is the same as true today. But in all of this, they eventually realized that Baal and Ashtaroth could not help them. And that's the truth of today. There's no help we're going to get from sin. There's no help that we're going to get from those other individuals that are engaged with us in sin. They're not going to help us. They're not going to help us because they can't help us. They can't help us any more than Baal and Ashtaroth could help Israel. Not at all. But the Israel that we're talking about, the God that we're talking about here in the days of the judges is the same God that we have today. And our God says that he's not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. 2 Peter 3 and verse 9. And then the third lesson, God will give us rest. That's what we see here in verse 11. Verse 11, God is showing that he can give us rest. And he wants to. He wants to give us rest. But we're going to have to do just like the children of Israel. We're going to have to seek it. There's so many that go on with their lives and all of its many distractions and all of the worldly cares. They chase after the things that they think will make them happy. But that thinking is wrong. In the end, they end up feeling empty, disillusioned, and tired. Tired of the things that has been such a mess up in their lives. See, only God can give true rest. A peace, we're talking about here a peace that the world fails to experience. A peace that the world cannot experience. It's like that peace in Philippians 4 and verse 7. It's a peace that passeth all understand. And as we close our study tonight, Donnie, would you read us Matthew 11? Well, if I get it up on the board, I know you'll read it. Okay, Matthew 11, verses 28 through 30.
Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light.
We need to remember what Christ said. Come unto me, I will give you rest. My yoke is easy. My burden is light. Compared to the yoke of sin, compared to the burden of sin, of how sin can pull us down, of how sin can take us under, it's just like Jesus said, his yoke is easy. Who was it? The proverb writer that says the way of the transgressor is hard. They don't think of it at the time because they're so engrossed in sin. But in the end, the way of the transgressor is hard. So, I believe these are 3 lessons that we should come away with in our study of Othniel. Lord willing, next week we want to look at Ehud, Shamgar, and Deborah. There's quite a bit that we find concerning Ehud and Deborah. Not, I think just one verse is all we have concerning Shamgar. So we may get through all 3 and we may not. But here's what I'd like for you to do is in preparation of next Wednesday night, I'd like for you to read Judges chapter 3, starting at verse 12, and read through chapter 5 and verse 21. And that will cover these 3, the period of these 3 judges. So you have the paper, I think I put it on it. If you've not, make a note of it, but do try to read, and that will help to better our study as we go along into it. Thank you so much for the time and opportunity that we have to be together and to study this evening.